Welcome everyone, my name is David van Hoeken. I'm a lecturer at Karel de Groot University College in Antwerp. I'm here with my colleague Yvan de Bois, who's conducting research here. I'm a researcher as well, so I'm not only a lecturer, I'm a researcher. I'm an applied scientific researcher. That means that I'm not in the field of academic research, as most of you are, but I do use real-time engines such as Unity to conduct research, amongst other things. For instance, now I'm doing a research project about automotive data, how to collect the data, and how to decrypt it, because every brand has its own way of encrypting, not encrypting, but at least obfuscating data. So the research project I do are relatively varied. There are a wide range of topics. My preference, however, is using something like this, or is using Unity, is using real-time 3D engines. Now, before we get started, and before I explain a little what real-time engines are, let me just restart this a little bit. We're going to have some eye candy in the background, just to get you all warmed up and interested in what I'm trying to do. But it's also a bit of a live demo, and you know how those go. They always tend to mess up a little bit. So, my background in research, I think just now, I teach real-time 3D development. That's a general umbrella term for anything that has to do with using these real-time engines. You could see it as a form of game development, or at least one of the things you can do with real-time 3D development is making games. However, we try to extrapolate, or we try to offer a wide range of development activities while teaching this course. The reason why we do this is not because game development isn't a valid topic, it's a form of media which is really prevalent, which has really wide range or wide audience. But the reason we try to pull it open is because the industry, the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a general move by various industries of using 3D, real-time 3D agents, and mostly, or a lot of times, we see them use something like Unity. The reason we do this is, well, there are many reasons why to do this. We'll go on some of these reasons a little bit later in the workshop. But one of the reasons is it's very accessible, and you can use it to generate rapid results. There's not a lot of prerequisites that you need to get started with it, and where you typically, when you're working in 3D environments, the traditional way of doing it is what we call offline rendering. You use a 3D program, and every image, if you're making an animation, if you're making a movie, every image, every frame as we call it, is rendered and can take anything from a few seconds to a few hours. So depending on your settings, it can take days. Typically what you see, for instance, if you're doing special effects for movies, we have render farms, we have series of computers where images are rendered in the equivalent of processing years. Now, a real-time engine works a whole lot differently. And with a real-time engine, we tend to have a high frame rate. So let's talk a little bit of what a frame rate is now. I imagine some of you might be familiar with gaming, or at least with the concept of gaming, and all of you might have already heard the term frame rate. Now, the typical traditional sense of frame rate is how many images per second you can display. For instance, if you take traditional cinematography, a movie, in cinema theater, you have roughly, or at least you would have 24 frames a second. That means a camera will collect 24 frames of actors, of scenes being exposed. Now, the way these are collected is with with a long aperture time, so the images have motion, they capture motion. Even though we have 24 frames a second, these motions appear fluid by something we call motion blur. Now, if we talk in terms of a game engine, however, the frame rate means something completely different. In one frame of an application, we try to not only generate an image, but we do some processing as well. Typically, every frame, your process or your game will process everything it needs to process. And typically, depending on what you're trying to simulate, or depending on what you're trying to achieve, You'll add a lot of code there yourself. You'll do physics calculations. You work with input that users provide. You request sources. You manipulate things. So whatever you're trying to do influences that frame rate and that frame rate largely is influenced by what we're trying to do in our simulations. That brings us to the term real time. So I started off with this presentation telling you that we're going to have a real-time workshop. Now there's no such thing as real-time processing for computers. Every single computer system works with cycles. What we do is an approximation. What we mean with real-time processing is that we tend to deliver things at such a high frame rate that we're no longer able to discern frames. Typically, when we look at things traditionally, when we think about games, seeing as this is the origins of this system is a game engine, we try to aim for at least 60 frames per second. The human being, it all depends, of course, on your age and your familiarity with these kinds of systems. We're sort of unable to detect frame rates higher than 50 frames per second. So we aim for at least 60 frames per second. That means that 60 times per second, our application has to process all we want it to process. If we're not able to, it lowers our frame rate. If it lowers our frame rate enough, we tend to have a less enjoyable experience. Firstly, if you look at the graphics, but secondly, our calculations are starting to show too much deviation because there's too much time between them. Especially when you're calculating physics, that can lead to really unexpected consequences. So, in this workshop, we'll be looking at things from a high level. We'll be looking at things, so what can I do with Unity as a researcher? What are the considerations? What's a typical workflow for me? What are the things I need to avoid? What are the things I can benefit from? These are all the things we're going to coach. We'll talk at a high level about these things. We'll go over some aspects that we need to consider, and then I'll show you how to set up a Unity scene. I'll show you how we get started. Now, this is not meant to be a tutorial, it's more like an outline approach. I talked with some of you already. I've been convinced of the fact that you're all highly accomplished in your fields. So I may tend to skip over some things which to me are self-explanatory. So please feel free. If you have any questions, you can interrupt me at any time. If you have any remarks, if you have any corrections, please do so. I'm more than happy to accommodate your requests. Anyways. Apart from what we're going to talk, what we love to see is some sort of relationships we can form with all of you. That doesn't mean that we would be accessible as like a contact or a support crew or anything else. It means that the school where I go, I have used to teach, we're experts not in doing academic research, we are experts in doing implementations. All our students are trained at a bachelor level, but are trained in immensely practical skills. They are, in theoretics, they might lack, but what they lack in theoretics, they make up with practical skills. So, but enough of that, let's have a little bit of a talk about how we would work as a researcher with Unity. Let me go to the presentation I made. Stop this as well. I'm sorry I can't keep providing iCam. We're going to switch to a presentation eventually. You know how it is. Now, if we look at Unity, what we're going to talk about, we're going to look at a general overview, already detailed some things. We will look at the benefits you might have while using an online or a real-time tool. Sorry. We will look at tools and assets that you might be using, because one of the ways you can benefit from something that sees widespread use as Unity is that a lot of things you can reuse that other people make, which is really important. It's important to get started early. It's important to not waste time on other things. In fact, you can look at Unity as a sort of a framework. And those of you who've used frameworks before will know what I mean when I say the best way to lose time with a framework is when you start customizing the framework. If you stay within the bounds of the framework, you win time. You can work really fast. You can have a lot of abstractions that do things for you. If you move away from the framework, if you start customizing, if you start doing things that you're not meant to do, you start losing time. Losing time. All of us, we never have enough time to do everything. So every bit of time we can save, every shortcut we can make, while still safeguarding the quality of our research, that's a benefit. Okay, so Unity is an origin game engine. Like I said, we've seen a lot of industries move to using Unity for real-time implementations, simply because it's a solid foundation, personally, but it provides a whole wide range of objects that you can use free of charge, or that you can share between users. But if you look at the bare essentials of what Unity really is, apart from the fact that a lot of people use it, it supports real-time rendering, which is a gift, right? When I talk about real-time rendering, with real-time rendering, we actually mean it's able to process a whole bunch of frames per second. It has a built-in physics engine, which is a huge benefit as well. A lot of times, if you're trying to simulate physics and you don't have a dedicated system to creating physics, you might encounter large processing times, and you might encounter results that are not really conductive, or which provides artifacts in the sense that deviations of what you would expect, or things that really not correspond to the expectations you have of how physics work. An engine like this is really good, but it takes some consideration. For instance, every time we use a 3D model in an engine like this, we have a concept that we call colliders. A collider is roughly the same shape of the 3D model we're trying to use. I say roughly because it's one of the things we optimize it. But it roughly has the shape of the object that has to have a physical presence in your simulation. And it's, as the term suggests, it collides with other colliders. So it provides a mean if you have, for instance, a surface, like in my intro just now, you saw the blocks fall, the fact that they fall, the fact that they interact with each other when they fall and with other surfaces, that is by means of colliders. Now, a lot of these terms might seem new, a lot of these concepts might seem weird, so don't worry about it. These are quite self-explanatory, Rob. We'll have a look at them. Now, having a physics engine that enables you to simulate things, and it also enables you to simulate interactions with objects, which is really helpful. Another extremely helpful aspect of using what we call a game engine. Sorry, it's a bad term. We look at it as a real-time 3D engine, but that's a bit of a word, so it's easier to say game engine. Now, it supports multiple platforms. So what do we mean with that? What's a platform? Your cell phone is a platform. VR glasses, those are platforms. You might have a Windows computer, you might have a Mac. These are all different platforms. You can have a team of people using different platforms and still able to collaborate. You have means of making an end product, what we call a build, that is usable on a whole bunch of different platforms, which is really handy. If you, for instance, make a tool, let's say you make an augmented reality tool, a tool to provide extra data for user training or whatever means, and you're able to deploy it on an Android system. You can make an Android build really easy, and people can install it on their phone. That's a huge benefit. You don't have to have any specific hardware. Any kind of hardware that is widely used will be able to be supported. You can switch between these platforms with a click. I say with a click, it also means clicking and then watching some progress watch. As you know, with a lot of software solutions is the case, where you have the option. Now, so what would be the benefit of using something for that in academic research? Now, depending on the research, it's always a question, like, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? That's hard for me to say. I've had a chat, and I had the luck of looking at some of your research projects, which were quite frankly amazing and really far advanced as I see them. So the goal would be not to explain to you how to conduct your research. I'm just providing a high-level explanation of things that might benefit you by using these things. For instance, When we say rapid prototyping and development, it means you can set up your environment, you can set up your basic objects, you can do this in a few hours. Depending on how well versed you are, how your experience is in using Unity, you can do this in a couple of minutes. In fact, speaking as a developer, because before I started teaching at AG, I spent 23 years working as a developer. About 5 or 6 years of that I spent not developing just software, but also hardware, testing hardware. I worked for a company where we developed photogrammetry drones, where initially the drones were used to make DEM, so digital elevation models. Later on, we used it to make multispectral imaging of plants, and we had a whole wide range of solutions there. So I was able to increase my knowledge and was just centered on working on screen and pressing F5 and trying something else. I moved on to test setups where you might lose your fingers if you use them in the wrong way. So speaking from a practical point of view, most of my experience was practical. And when I started teaching and when I started seeing the benefits of using Unity, one of the things that attracted me was the ability to really get moving fast. And you were able to, it's such a degree of accuracy, such a degree of approaching the real world, that with a minimum of effort, you are able to provide enormously convincing results. Now, rapid prototyping development, that's a term we use. You can make you can really easily make something really quick. There are tools for that. There are specific tools that allow you to make environments, that allow you to make objects. Specifically, there's something called Proton, for instance. I know that Ivan is a tool that he likes using. So, but apart from that, there are a whole bunch of things available in something we call an asset store. An asset store is an online resource where you can reuse items such as scripts, environments, visualization tools, AI tools, but also simple objects, things like that. Most of them, or a lot of them, can be used for free. So you can get started with Unity. It provides you a real-time simulation. Again, high frame rate simulation, to be honest. Not only for visualization, not only for providing something on screen that is approachable, that is accessible, that is easily interpretable, but it's also behind the screen, like in the nuts and bolts. If you look at the application, if you look at the data that's being processed and the data that's being generated, it's able to handle extremely large data sets. Apart from its ability to handle these data sets, due to the fact that it supports so many platforms, it's widely used for virtual reality and augmented reality. We used to, or we tend to combine this under the nomination XR for extended reality, which is kind of an umbrella term for everything that involves not using a flat screen representation or pancake representation, as we sometimes call it. On top of that, seeing as one of the traditional or the original uses for it is game development, and seeing as you can't really, or you can, but advise you to create a game by yourself. It's fun to do, you can achieve a lot with it, but mostly in game development, what you see is we have large teams with people with really specific roles working together. So one of the things that Unity does really well is provide collaborative features. This is also a benefit. Now, collaborative features, it ties into something online code storage by means of something like Git or other social repositories. So we'll be having a look at that as well. Of course, it's not really Unity specific like that, but it's something I always like to include when we talk about relevance and healthy workflows. So those are, from a high level, the benefits. Now, depending on each project, what you'll be doing, you might recognize some benefits for yourself. You might recognize some detractions or some disadvantages of using that engine as well. Now, the goal is, or the advice in that case is, do not try to work against the disadvantages. Try to figure out a way around, or at least a way to avoid them. Now, I talked about these tools and assets, right? I talked about this asset store, as we call it, where you can just enter the search term, find objects that you might want to use, click on them, and integrate them with your project, which is a nice way to get started, a nice way to skip over the skills that you might not have. If you say, well, I need to simulate something, and I need to simulate a complex model, but you don't have any modeling skills, which is quite natural if that's not your interest, or if that's not the way you get trained. You can spend a whole lot of time getting those skills, which is never a bad idea, but you might not be able to have that time in your project. If you're able to download something finished or ultimately what you need, I don't have to draw a picture to explain how much that helps you. Now, one of these tools and the assets that you can use are visualization, data visualization plugins. Another tool is AI integration plugins. There's something called machine learning agents, I think. I'm looking at you, is that the proper term for it?
It used to be.
It used to be, yeah. It has evolved. Yep. So there's a whole framework that you can use if you want to provide your reinforcement learning techniques, if you want to train models or objects with that. For instance, you can use a tool set that provides you with basic framework, the bare bones, the essentials that you need to get started. It still allows a degree of customization, but again, thinking in terms of workload, thinking in terms of getting started and then being productive, always try to stay within those frameworks. Now, together, you can see these as simulation packages. Now, these simulation packages, they have a wide range of applications and they take on a wide range of forms. For instance, you might have a simulation package that allows you to use an Oculus Quest VR glasses with a whole bunch of examples and pre-made stuff in there. So you don't have to write your codes from scratch. You can start early, you can skip or at least prevent some of the what we call the scaffolding, right? The road work that you need to do for every project again. Most of the times you'll find a package that suits your needs and allow you to get started. Now, what do we need? What do we need to use Unity? The good news is you don't need a lot. The bad news is you need those three things, not bad news. These are requirements, you can't skip these requirements. You have to have a computer that allows you to do some 3D work. This is not an absolute requirement in the sense that really Unity won't run on a computer that's not really able to do 3D stuff, but it's to preserve your sanity. It's a lot easier to work with something to work with a computer that's able to render 3D scenes easily. It facilitates you to work. It's a lot less frustrating if you don't have to look at choppy frames or at progress bars or at icons of hourglasses that are rotating while you wait for the computer to do something. So a 3D compute is really one of the things I would recommend. You need to have a Unity installation, of course. This is pretty self-explanatory. If I'm not mistaken, you've all had some communication where we invited you to have an installation ready. You should not. If you don't have it ready, we'll spend some time just now so I can show you how to get started on that. Depending on the connectivity you have, you might not be able to install it for this workflow. So when we try to do stuff, feel free to move around and then compare with somebody who has a working installation. To use the Unity installation, you need to have a license. Now the good news is all these licenses are free. They're not just free for personal stuff, they're free for commercial stuff as well. As long as your revenue is lower than $100,000 a year, you're able to use Unity in a commercial way. Now, that being said, there are some nuances as to using Unity in an academic context. For instance, if you're going to use it for your research and your research is to form a service contract or something else, you fall into these classic revenue models, that's fine. Once you start teaching a whole bunch of people how to use it, so imagine that one of you says, well, I'm going to organize a class, I'm going to have 100 students, and I'm going to teach those 100 students Unity, then these licensing details start to become a little bit more complicated. But to get started, to get the right license, you just take a personal license. Right? During the install, you have to choose a license. You take a personal license. It's free, and it will remain free. I advise you, when you identify yourself for this license, I advise you to use your own personal email address. It doesn't mean you can't use your academic email address, but it does mean all the tools and assets that you'll be reusing, all the things you will access that are pre-built, or all the frameworks that you might choose to use in your products, they're associated with your license. So if you ever change an email address, so for instance, let's say you've finished your work here and you move on and you start working with something else, or you start working for yourself, you might not have able access to your academic email address anymore. So you might lose all the things you've collected over the years altogether. It's not a huge issue, just something to consider. If you did already create a license and you're using your academic email address, that is perfectly fine. You won't see any detriment to what you're doing. Right. Are there any questions so far? Who here has already worked with Unity? Right. Someone in the back? So there are 2 of you. That's perfect. Who here has ever played a video game? Luckily, there are some more people. The reason why I ask this is a lot of the terms, a lot of the ways you'll be working, it's a lot of the terms you'll be encountering are easier to figure out or easier to understand for people who have some experience with commercial PD real-time environments being games. Now, don't let that scare you. As I said, it isn't easy to get started. So, I propose we try something else and I show you some of the ways you can work with some approach to the workflows and how you can do this. Feel free, like I said, feel free to interrupt me at any time. One of the issues by teaching something like this, especially when you're experienced with using it, I tend to skip over the things that are self-explanatory to me, which might not be for you. It doesn't mean that you're lacking something in knowledge or experience or insight. It's just, you will have probably encountered the same thing in your research as well. What is self-explanatory, what you're used to using, you no longer understand the complexity of it. In no way I'm trying to imply that I'm an expert in these things. It's just that I use it a lot and I'm amazed about things which are easy or self-explanatory to me, but might not be to you. In that case, it's your responsibility to say, hey Dave, I don't understand what you're doing, or could you repeat this step for me because I'm having difficulty following along. Alright, now how do we do this? How do we get started? Well, if you've installed Unity, who had the chance to install Unity? Did you have? Alright, a couple of people. Let's go. If you don't worry about it. I'll do this slowly. There will be a recording. If you want, you can always, I think you can always have a look at the recording as well. But seeing as Unity sees such a widespread use, you will not find only this recording, you will literally find a million tutorials on how to get started. So no fear. Alright. Now, there are 2 things to the Unity installation. One is the hub, the Unity hub, and the other is the Unity instance. Now, with an instance, we mean a specific Unity installation under a specific version number. The way you manage these specific instances and the way you list your projects and the way you start a project is through the Unity hub. Now, no matter which of the 2 you try to choose, just type in Unity in one of your start menus, even if it's a specific Unity instance, or it's the hub that you select, as long as there's no specific instance open, it will always start in the Unity hub for you. Let me show you. I click Unity here, so what in fact will open is an instance of the Unity hub. Again, if these terms are confusing, then it's my fault, and I'm more than happy to explain a little more about it. When you start it up, you'll have a whole list of projects that you've already made in Unity. As you can see, I like working with it, so I have a whole bunch of projects there already. What I also have, if I click in the menu on the left side, is a whole list of different Unity versions. Now, why is that? Why do I have so many different versions of Unity? Why don't I stick always with the latest version? Now, if you're doing a lot of development, you'll sooner or later, you'll learn that if you change your version of the tool that you use to manage your software project, you might arrive at a whole bunch of extra work. Simply put, if a version changes, a lot of things change, that may change your project. If we, like for instance, with Ivan and I worked on a simulation project where people learn to use high pressure systems in a chemical factory. I was initially going to show you this. I brought along my VR glasses and I'm going to see how this works to give an example of what some of the research things we were doing. But the baggage handlers, I played football with my backpack, I think, and the glasses are no longer usable for real. Anyways, but if you do a lot of development, you know, once you start developing in a particular version, you stick to that version. You try so hard to never to change the initial version of the tools that you're using. If you do, you might encounter a whole bunch of extra work, which is not related to your research goals or any goal you might have. It's just extra busy work, which is always something we try to avoid. Another reason for it, it's not always under your control, by the way. If you use something like an Oculus Quest VR glasses, they are managed by Meta. And Meta decides when to send out firmware updates. So you might prepare a new version, you might be able to get ready to show a demo for really important people, and then Facebook decides to send out an update. And you turn on your glasses, you see a little progress bar, but when you know at the end of the progress bar, everything you've ever made might be messed up. So that's why I have different instances. That's why the Hub provides you with the possibility to install different version numbers. Installing these version numbers is quite easy. If you've done the setup, if you went to the page where you can download Unity, you already made a selection of one of these environments. So that's not spending too much time on that. You also have some links where you can learn the basics. Now, I'm not connected to the internet actually, and that is why this list is empty. But you have some really nice tutorials to get started. If you have you can do a boring tutorial, and you'll learn a lot. You can do a fun tutorial as well, and you learn so much more if it's able to entertain you. There's also some links to community. Now, seeing as Unity is such a cheap tool, free tool as it were, and seeing as it's used for so many different goals, you'll have access to an enormous community of people, granted, people with different levels of experience, but anyway, the chances are every time you encounter a problem, somebody will have encountered a problem already, or something similar. And if you don't find a complete solution to your problem, you might find ways to get started on your problem using work with other people. So, now you don't have to access this in this way. One of my favorite ways to access the community is to just Google and just enter Unity, and then I enter my search term, and 9 times out of 10, that is the way I tend to look up things. If I really have to look at workflows, then I just do the same thing, but then I use Unity. I just start enter myself in YouTube, and at least I get an indication of how to install. Now, we're all specialists, we'll be doing specialized work. That means you won't find any clear-cut solutions. If you're finding clear-cut solutions of the things you're trying to do, then it's time to analyze your goals you might have. So, that's of course another. So, how do we create a project? Well, if we go back to the list of projects using the little menu on the left side, you notice that you can select a project that already exists by just clicking on that, or you can use one of the buttons on the right, top right there, to create a new project. Now, what's a good idea if you don't have any really specific end goals in mind, really specific platforms which you're targeting, a really good idea is that you use 3D project, which 3D engine, self-explanatory, but you use this selection or you use the template called URP. Now, what does URP stand for? The two last letters, because on top of that you see HDRP, the two last letters mean render pipeline. Render pipeline is simply the way the graphics are created. To generalize, everything you do with Unity will mean a unit of work, so a bunch of code, a bunch of logic that's being followed through And the end result of such a unit of work is one frame. It ends with the generation of a graphic. Doesn't mean that your code is always tied to graphics, of course. It's just the concept of the frame rate, which I explained earlier today. With RP, we mean the way those graphics are created. Now, what's important to that is how smoothly it runs on how many different systems. If you take URP, that stands for Universal Random Pipeline. It means you can run it on any system you might have. You can run it on a 12-year-old Android phone with a cracked screen, as well as a really brand new, very expensive 3D capable computer. It will run just as fine on both systems. It is optimized, or it is centered on optimizing itself by making a build. If you want to go to the high-end graphics modes, you can choose AGRP. Those are, generally speaking, the extremes. But I always advise people to get started using URP, the Universal Random Pipeline. So you select it, and as you can see, it contains a sample scene. Now, all of these things, these random pipelines, which I've been mentioning, these are components which you can add to Unity at any point during the development process. The sooner you add it during that process, the better, or the more you save extra work or superfluous work. Well, but in any case, you can get started right away. You can add that at a later time. I'll show you how to do it. It's really self-explanatory. Location-wise, an important consideration for working in Unity, but working in other environments as well, is that your path is not too deep. Now, what do I mean by that? What's a path that is really deep? That's something that I see my students do all the time. They go to their desktop, and on their desktop, they make a subfolder Unity projects. And under that Unity project folder, they make another subfolder with a particular date or something else in mind. And then if you look at the path, if you look at where those files are actually placed, you will see something like C, users, username, desktop, name of the project. There's a path that means every file at that location, a file name, in computer terms, is not just the name of the file and the extension. For computers, the file name is the whole path included. So everything from the station level, where you start from, and all the different folders in there. And there's a limitation to that, especially in certain environments, such as Unity. There's a limitation on how long this thing can be. So one of the worst things you might have is you start your project, and at some point you're trying to make a build, or you're trying to make or include a library, or you're trying to extend what you already have, and you run it into an error that's hardly definable, that really not points to the fact that you're too many subfolders deep, but it is caused by it. So, as a consideration to have is that you place your projects as shallow, in as shallow a path as possible. Of course,
yeah, question. If it's possible to put the projects on the desktop environment?
How do you mean? Do you mean as a desktop folder?
Yes.
I would advise against it, because you might run into the problem I just said. Another consideration for that is you might encounter a compute problem that forces you to reinstall your operating system. Now, nowadays, the cases where that needs to happen are generally very rare, but if it happens, you will lose your desktop folder. You might lose your user folder. And then you might, so something that seems really natural extension of where you place your file might not be accessible at all. If you do, you don't have to, but if you do like I do, if you take a folder that's in the root of the disk you're trying to use, you will never run into a situation where you have to reinstall your computer and you lose access to the disk. Now, it's always possible depending on the gravity of the problem that might force you to reinstall something. But this is typically. Now, if you're going to use a source control system, if you're going to use a repository, I actually already skipped this step. If you're going to use something like this, you would first create your project in GitLab, GitHub, whatever you're used to working with. You would first create the project there, then clone it to your disk, and in that directory that you've built, then you would start making your project. If you don't, it's an extra step you have to take. Again, it's just some an advice I'm giving. So, for just demonstration purpose, I'm just going to take my project folder, and then I have to choose a name. So let me just start off by referring to the dates. If I'm not mistaken, we are the 5th of July. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Let's see. Let's see. So we choose a project name. Project name is not that important, but it is important in the sense that this is a subdirectory that will be formed. And initially, every time you make a build, every time you go from your editor environment to something that you can deploy on a bunch of different platforms, it will take the name you see there initially. Those are all things we can change. So we choose a name, we choose a proper location, and we click create project. Now, every time you create a new project, or every time you open a project on a new device, or a new computer, or a new development station, it takes a long time. Why is that? The reason why it is because Unity will create a whole bunch of different temporary files. Files that enable the smooth use of the editor environment itself. But it does mean, you can hear it from a computer, it does mean a lot of work and a little bit of intensive work. That is just the first time you open a project on your computer. The next time you open it, you will not encounter this delay. It also means if I were to create a project, and I've made a repository of that project, and then you clone that repository and start working with it, you have to create all those temporary files, because it doesn't make sense to put those temporary files in the repository. When we create a Unity project and we put it in something like that, we are able to use a git ignore template. Now, all these terms you might not know already, don't worry about it. They're quite easily explained what I'm doing now. Once you do that, you can add a template that prevents taking all those temporary files and storing it in your repository. Now, if this has worked, if you were able to create this project, you will see something like this, a temporary screen. The reason why it's called blue, by the way, is because it is still working on rendering the scene. But after a while, you have some default objects there. Now, the only reason these are there are just to provide you with some visualization to show you that everything is working fine. You can do something with it if you specifically are in need of a hard time in your project. It's there. It's just to show you that, to give you some pointers on how to get started and to make sure show you that the running pipeline is working. Because, as you can see from the right side of the screen, we're using the universal rendering pipeline. Every time you start your project, you might see something like this. So there's usually, if not right here, there will be a link where you can switch it off. Anyways, this is the editor interface. So what do we see? Well, there are two main regions, or three main regions to the screen. Before we can discuss those, however, we need to think a little bit of how Unity makes or presents environments to you. We call a scene one 3D. Well, I can never build this better, like a better term, a scene. If you were to talk about this in terms of game development, that could be a level. It's a self-contained unit where 3D objects are placed and have their own behavior. If I press the play button on top of the screen, then that particular scene, as we will call it, will start running. Of course, there's nothing in that scene, it's just a placeholder to show you that everything is working. And there's one camera in there, but there's nothing moving, there's nothing really going on. This is just to verify that our stuff has worked. We see the scene here. As you can see, you have a viewport here, you have a 3D viewport. And there's a list next to that viewport we call the hierarchy. The hierarchy, so this list here, I'll just show you using my mouse to show here. This list here is a list of all the items in our scene contains a hierarchy. It means that you can assign objects to other objects and make them their parents. You can create sort of a parent-child relationship. Really quite logical in terms of how to use it, but also in terms that, for instance, if I were to add a cube to the scene, and I make sure that cube is placed somewhere. Let me just drag it over here and show you. If I were to add another object to that cube, for instance, imagine that I'm going to add a sphere there. That sphere, as you can see in the hierarchy, is now a child of the cube. That means, if I were to move the cube, then all child objects are manipulated as well. Not just movement, but everything.
Excuse me, what is hierarchy?
Hierarchy is a sort of, there are objects that are in charge of other objects. For instance, when you work at a company, there's a hierarchy where your boss tells you what to do, but you don't tell your boss what to do. Well, you can try it, of course. Generally speaking, there's a, like, if you see something like in terms of a military, you have the general, and the general is the boss of all the soldiers. That is a hierarchy. It's a good question, by the way. That's a typical example of something I skip over.
Maybe point out the exact window. Maybe that's where the
So you can actually see here that this little list here on the side is called hierarchy. I'm trying to think of can anyone give a Portuguese explanation for hierarchy? You might be here. Very good. Thank you. Yes. So, in the hierarchy, in our scene, we don't only place objects, we don't not only have access to objects, we can create hierarchies as well. Now, the goal of these hierarchies is hard to explain with an abstract level. These are things that you will find when you're creating stuff that are really natural ways of grouping objects together. So, we have the viewport here and the hierarchy. Now, if you look closely though, next to the title of this viewport, next to the word scene, there's a tab called game. What this tab shows you is the camera. Every scene should have at least one camera. If you make a build, if you make an end project, if you make something to put on a platform, what you will see is always recorded by a camera. That's an important concept. It's an important concept for once because it might not be self-evident because yeah, you see your scene here. And when I press play, you will see some images as well. But the scene view, that is just used to compose your scene. The game view is what actual users will be seeing. Now, a user can be anyone. If you're running a simulation, whoever's observing the simulation, that's your user. The observers of that simulation will be, or the simulation itself will be captured by a camera. In that view, you can see what the end result will look like. Again, if these things are confusing, don't worry about it. These, like I said, there's a high learning curve. Okay, so we have the hierarchy on the left. We have our viewports with the scene view and a game view. There's a big screen on the right here, which is currently completely empty, which we call the inspector. Every item, every object, every script, anything you might be using in Unity will have details, will have properties, will have settings you can manipulate. You can see those settings in the inspector. So if I take an item in my scene by selecting it in the hierarchy, or if I just click on an object in scene views, basically does the same thing, you will see on the right side a whole bunch of what we call components. Now the way this works in Unity is that every object that you're able to place in the scene will have one or more components. For instance, we are looking at a cube here, so the item that I selected is a cube. By the way, if you select an item in the hierarchy or directly in the scene view, and you place your mouse cursor in that scene view, if you press F, you can zoom in. Might not seem really important, but one of the ways we reach time is by panning and zooming and selecting objects. Every object that is able to be placed in the scene will have one more components that I just said now. One component will always be present, no matter what object you place, no matter what you intend to do with it, no matter which form it takes, it will always have a transform component. Now, why is that? Well, transform component just determines where it is in the scene. If you look at it, you will see that this transform component has a vector information determining where it is placed. There's a vector data object that allows you, or that allows to configure how it is rotated. And there's the same threefold vector data object that allows you to represent the scaling of it. Any object that's placed in the scene will always have a transform component. When we move objects, a lot of times we will be manipulating that transform component. Not the only way to move objects, definitely not the recommended way depending on what you're trying to do, but it's nevertheless an important aspect to be able to visualize objects. Now, the caveat here is that it's only for objects that are already in the scene. This brings me to the next part of the Unity interface, namely the project view. Everything you see here is found on your disk. This is an actual file that's on your computer. I can show you. I can do a right click or a control click, I presume, on the Mac environment. I can choose Show in Explorer or Show in Finder when you use a Mac. And it opens the correct folder. It shows you exactly where you are. If I go to the folder called Assets, and if I go to, for instance, Settings, I see here a forward render asset. If I go to Unity and I go to Settings, I will also have a forward render asset. That means if you want to add items, for instance, you make something in Blender or another 3D modeling component, you want to use it in your project or for an animation, whatever you might think of, you can just grab the file, place it in the folder, it will appear here. Not only will it appear here, Unity will start describing some metadata for it. It's not that important what it just is. These are just additional information apart from the actual file that you paste there. You can disregard it. It's just something you might see, and in this way, it's not containing any surprises. Now, seeing as these objects are not placed in the scene, they are missing their transform components. But in any case, apart from that, you will see, or you will still be able to use this inspector component to look at properties and settings that you can assign or that are found in these files that you create. Now, like I said, we can import our own files here if you want to use them. There's a lot of files that we can create simply for Unity itself. For instance, imagine that for some way you have a good reason to change all the lighting settings for your environment. Anywhere in your project folder, you can perform a right click. You have a create option on the top of that right click menu. And if you open that up, you see any Unity specific files you might be able to create. If I continue my example, that is one way how I would go about creating a file that contains all my settings for it. Now, while we're still in lighting, let's talk about a little bit about this. This is a graphical environment, no matter how we cut it. The way light works, of course, in real life is very hard to approach in a simulation. The way it works, and depending on the render pipeline, I should say, the way it works, is Unity simulates a number of bounces. If we have a light source, and we have an object, for instance, you might have a spotlight here, you might have a floor here, a game engine will calculate light rays coming from that object, bouncing, and then traveling on to bounce on other objects as well. You can configure how many bounces it does, just to limit the computational needs to be able to figure out to do everything. So if we're talking about multiple frames a second, that means if you have any real-time or light sources in your scene, every time, 60 times per second, all these light waves are calculated, all these bounces are calculated. So this is one of the ways we optimize working it, or we increase what we call the framework, is by limiting how this bounces. Now, in real life, due to the fact that light waves keep on bouncing, they get attenuated, but they keep bouncing everywhere, they tend to fill up the room with light in more or less successful ways. For instance, if you look at the corner of something, you will always see a lower light value there in real life. Now, Game Engine tries to simulate that as well as it can without impacting the performance. But see, as the light bounces are not enough to fill the whole scene with light, there's also something we call ambient light. You can see that as filament light. Some of you who might have done some photography in the day, there are light sources that are direct, and there are light sources that are used to fill the scene. So apart from actual light sources in Unity or in the scene, you also have what we call ambient light that provides that fill-in light. Now I won't go into too much detail about this because this is a topic, all of these topics, these are topics which I can spend days talking about, specifically lighting, the difference between real-time lighting and what we call baked lighting. I won't go into it. I'll save you the trouble. I'll preserve your sanity as much as I can. So, the inspector is used to see all the details, to manipulate objects, to change settings. Some of these settings have their own screen which we can look at. But depending on needs, these are things that you will automatically find your way towards. They might seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but you'll get the hang of it real easy. Now, something that is used a lot of times is when you use, or a really common workflow, is where you make a model or you import a model, and you want to use that model in your 3D environment. So, for instance, let's assume you're using a tool such as Blender, something like this. And you want to know, well, how can I go from something I made here to something I want to simulate real time? Now, imagine that we're trying to make an object. I'll keep it really, really simple. I'll just use my cube here. So I made a scene in Blender. This is not a tutorial about Blender. I'm just showing you the workflow from a finished object. So let's say when I take this cube, I'm going to go to edit mode, and let's say I want to have rounded edges on this cube. So I do some manipulations in my modeling tool. I select my object, and here comes the specifics to be using in Unity. There are a lot of ways to have files containing 3D models. Unity is really helpful in the fact that it allows you to use a whole bunch of different formats or file extensions. For instance, if I save this as a Blender file, so a file is specific for this modeling environment, if I save it like that, Unity will recognize it. And Unity will allow me to use the Blender file right away, which is really handy. A better technique, however, is that you sort of optimize this, because when we have a Blender file, it means that that Blender file contains a whole bunch of information specific to your modeling program. You might not want it. You lose some performance with it. So a better way is to choose a format or a file extension that is optimized across a whole bunch of different systems. One of those file formats is something called an FBX. There are a lot of different ways to export a model, but FBX is a good one because FBX can not only contain your model, it can contain the materials that your object is made of, it can even contain animations. If for some reason you're simulating human movement is immensely complex. The only good way to represent or to simulate or animate human movement is by recording human movement. There's a technique called motion capture that gets translated into an animation typically what you do in these contexts is you download an animation in the form of an FBX. Might even be an FBX rather than modelets. You can download the animation just without the 3D representation and then plug it into your own presentation. Now this is an advanced topic and it's going to stick to the basics, so I'll keep it and I'll show you a simple workflow. So I'm going to export this as an FBX. We export it to the right place. There's a trick I always do. I open my assets folder in the Explorer. I copy the file location, and then I use that when I export to Blender. I paste that file location, and then I don't have to go around finding the proper direction. Now, this might seem superfluous, but I can guarantee you, if you have a lot of projects, it's sometimes really difficult to stick in the right folders and to export everything to the right place. So any way to facilitate that, any way to automate that, any way to prevent errors is a good way to work. I'm going to make a folder here called models. You don't have to, but it base, we assign a base to everything. So I press Enter to select the folder. I press Enter to, again, which is a little bit too fast, I didn't intend to, so let me do it again. And you export. I choose my FBX file, and then there's some important consideration. Every 3D package, if it's a real-time engine, or a modeling package, or a CAD package, it has a coordinate system. There's a way to determine what is up, what is horizontal, what is forward and back. We typically denote these as axes, an x-axis, a y-axis, a z-axis. While every application like this will use those three axes, what those axes mean is different for every application. For instance, in Unity, the z-axis is forward and backwards. That has its origin in how computer images are generated and sent to video cards. In a modeling problem like this, the z-axis is up and down. So you might have some really weird artifacts when you're exporting objects. Now, the only thing you need to do is you rotate your object 90 degrees either in your environment where you start from or the environment where you end. So it's just something to consider. You're not doing anything wrong if you encounter this issue. Let me just try this again. Go to my models directory and export it as rounded. There's some things you might consider. You might want to select only selected objects. This is specific for this environment, so I'm going to skip over this. I'm just going to export it. What I've done now, how I did it is not important, but what I've done is I've created a folder, and in that folder, my cube has ended up, which I've created in my 3D modeling program. Then I can just drag it into my scene like this. I can just add it to the hierarchy like this. Whatever way you want to use it is fine. The goal of this is to illustrate how extremely easy it is to make something and use it in your environment. Now, like I said, I could talk about this for days, and I really enjoy doing so. But I'm going to move towards the end here by showing you one final consideration, which is pretty important. There are two ways to change how Unity works and what you can do with it. Did you have questions? Feel free to do it if you have. Alright, so one of the ways we can change how Unity works is by using the package manager. For instance, if I open the package manager, I'm able to add elements to this specific Unity installation. There's another way to do it as well, but specifically to use objects or to ways to manipulate procedures, ways to do calculations, visualizations, frameworks and plugins. We open the package manager, we switch it to Unity registry, and you see all the different pre-made, supported by Unity releases of things you might reuse. You can even add your own sources, like the research project that I've did, we released the library for this, which we hosted on Git, and we were able to add to this package manager. So there's a lot of liberty here I have. A lot of things you might use as a researcher. For instance, let's say you're doing a research project where you want to visualize things using VR glasses, Oculus glasses, you will install this plugin. And this will enable you to release to the glasses. So this is more of a component setup, more of ways to change how Unity works. If you want to add pre-made content, however, we go to Window again, and we open the assets. I don't have any working internet connection right now, so I'm not able to show you. I will show you if I can somewhere. No, I'm not able to. I should have thought about having a valid internet connection. But anyways, if I go to the window here, and if I go to Asset Store, a browser should open with a web resource, a simple search engine where you can enter your search term, where you can find and reuse resources. Like that, which is a use tax. Anyways, to prevent me going on for the rest of the day, I'd like to stop here, and I'd like to ask you if you have any questions or things I can explain a little bit better.
But right now, just to the same options you have in this 2D modeling or so, in my left top corner with the icon with the cloud or so, but I can't not see the same list of packages.
Yes. When you open a package manager for the first time, it only shows you the packages that are included in your current project. So I started a sample project, and that sample project contains the universal random pipeline package. So you can see it there. The first time you open it, by the way, you might even see it at the screen. To change it and to actually see what's available, you click on the top here and you switch to Unity Registry. You can also switch to My Asset. And remember what I said when setting up the license, every time you reuse an asset, it gets associated with your license. This is how you see the list of items you already have. But what you were looking for is switching it to Unity Registry, I presume.
Unity Registry, Nash.
Now you should see your
Okay, it's not appear at the list.
Are you logged in the Unity Hub? Did you create a license?
Yes,
Yeah.
you said I need something. So.
Is just to change instead of in project is Unity to registry.
Sometimes if you're not logged into the Unity Hub, you can check it by the way by clicking on your username. That's the devil's in the details. No, but these are typical things you encounter, right? You're trying to follow along with the workflow, and you want to be missing one thing, and you write something totally different. So that's what it's about.
Oh, yeah, the old services.
Yeah, this is a good point, by the way. There are some selections you can make, or selections that enable you to work that change the way things are visualized. Any more questions? Yeah.
What is the extent of the physics engine of Unity?
Sorry?
What is the extent of the engine that relates physics to the real world? Like, does it deal well with fluids?
Well,
is it only gravity, collision?
It's the one-on-one link to real-life dimensions or real-life physics simulations.
Yeah, physics simulation.
Initially, when you start on the project, this is really limited. There's a game engine, there's a physics engine there that you can configure, but the initial setup is extremely limited and is just meant for simple object interactions. Typically, gravity is applied as an acceleration factor, and objects have what we call colliders that allow them to interact with each other when they hit each other at different velocities or energies. If you're going to do fluid simulations, for instance, I thought there was a question you had or part of your question. It becomes a lot more difficult. If you want to have accurate fluid simulations, what you would typically be doing, if it has to be really accurate, you will use a package that allows you to do offline fluid simulation running. What you would typically do, for instance, if you just for presentation purposes or to have approximations, then there's a lot of options to be doing in Unity itself. There's specifically something we call fluid shaders, which not only give the graphical representation of fluids, but also interact with colliders. In the sense that if you simulate an ocean surface and you simulate a boat with the correct colliders, it will behave as you want it to. But there's a limit. It's a very interesting because it's not as much a built-in limitation. It's something we need to consider adding ourselves.
And is it often open source? Like,
yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, you will always be able to find something that costs money. That is wrong. Especially when you're using the assets. So there's a lot of people who make a living of doing these things, or they hide it behind a paywall on a what's it called, on a Patreon account or something like that, where you charge you €50 a month to be able to access the really high-level coding stuff for Unity. My advice is to always step away from what you need to pay for. If you use free resources, you might not directly arrive at the result you will want, but you'll learn something along the way, which is a lot more important than having a content and price solution, according to me. It all depends on your requirements, your availability, your budget, your patience.
Yeah, you probably don't raise doubts. Do you know about some projects that interface custom-made simulators of physics? Imagine that well-known and very powerful multi-physics software for the fluids is very good. And maybe there's an interface, maybe you can import.
Don't have an answer to that. Never used it myself up to this point. Maybe I can put it in the blank.
Even for that light simulations, I found interesting when you said that we can minimize or limit the bonding, the reflections of the light because they can go forever. But there are softwares that can make very accurate simulations.
If your research goal would be to specifically reproduce that behavior of lights, you will go for a really for a high performance setup where you simulate as accurate or at least to some degree as much as possible real life circumstances. If the goal would just be to have really convincing lighting or lighting that allows your visualizations to stand out, there's a technique we call baking. And light baking is you set your settings for lighting extremely high, so extremely high quality, and you hit a button. All the results of the lighting are calculated and they're saved in what we call EXRs or image or light masks. Specific image files that contain light information along with information about objects. These are placed at real time, so when your scene is running, these are placed as over your objects, by lack of a better term, and they simulate extremely accurate lighting. Now, from an academic standpoint, I presume that you will probably, if you have something to do with lighting, you will probably go for the high performance approach where you recreate the lighting as much as possible. And this is very dependent on hardware. There's something called an RTX technology. You might see it if you buy graphical processors to place in your computers. They might have the RTX denomination in front of them. And that means ray tracing. We tend to simulate these light rays, or we tend to explain them as light rays that bounce on a surface and then hit another surface. A lot of the times, though, these are just approximations. When you have an RTX graphical processing unit, however, they do simulate these either the light tracing or ray tracing capabilities, and the goal would be to approximate real life circumstances. But in real life, light bounces infinitely. It just gets attenuated. If I shine a flashlight to Mars, that light will arrive on Mars, be it extremely attenuated. And the game engine can't 60 times per second do these calculations. So there are some sacrifices. Anything else I can enlighten you with?
I know there's a really good competitor against Unity, the Unreal Software. What are the main differences between both of them?
The difference is marketing, mostly, sadly. Especially when we look at it in terms of game engines, there's something we call cross-centralization. There are people who try to espouse the advantages of one game engine towards the other. From experience, though, it's actually, Ivan did some research at this, and he found that Unity was the most widespread game engine in use nowadays. But from a developer standpoint, for somebody who has made software for 24 years, I'm really hesitant to calculate how many years I've been doing it now. But from that background, I can guarantee you it's not the engine you use, it's the people who use that engine. It's the talent, not the talent, it's the amount of effort you put into it and the lengths that you're willing to go to achieve the results. Some engines lend them better to some things, but generally speaking, take it with a grain of salt, but generally speaking, saying that one engine is better than another doesn't mark it for. It's a team, people that use it, that determine those results. Which is a blessing and a curse. Alright? I hope I gave you at least a push in the right direction. There's also something you can do in a couple of hours. I've shown you the basics of the Unity interface. You have my business cards. I'm always willing to help. I'm always willing to engage with you if you have specific questions. What I'm not here to do, I'm not a tutorial point. I'm not a support engineer. I hope you realize that. If you have complex issues which you like to converse with me, I'd be more than happy to do so. If there's any way you say, well, we have this idea of using Unity, but we also need some way of implementing things, then there's also a possibility to contact me through the school and contact our students. Our students are always ready to collaborate on these things, and like I said, they might not have your academic backgrounds, but they're well versed in implementations. They're really good at doing this. So there might be an incredible synergy just below the surface.
So I'm expecting to see some code, I don't know, imagine to move this cube.
Yes.
Is it to C++? Is it just or
It's C#.
Yeah. No, I should have mentioned that already. Let me just open up a project for you to demonstrate a little bit.
a simple example of make some movements?
Yeah. Or I can make a simple example. Let's see. If we were to talk about a simple example, if I were to take my, if you were to take this existing project that's open, and we were to go to this cube, and you want to manipulate this cube, you want to apply some code to have it move. Now, if you want to just make it adhere to physics, we can add a component called a raising body component. And once you add that component, it enables you to make that objects adhere to the physics that's applied in your scene, which is something that's pretty well about. That's just a simple solution. If I were to press play right now, you will see that the cube will drop down because one of my game cube is maximized like this. You just press play. You will see the cube falls down. It's now the physics are applied to it now. If you want to manipulate it, if you want to say, I want to have fine control on how to move it, you would typically do something like this. You would go to your script directory, you will create a script, you call it, in my case, move example. And you can just double click it or press your enter key, whatever that allows you to open files and your programming environment will open. Apart from that, while that is open, as you go back here for a second, this script is now a component. If you remember my explanation telling you that every object in the hierarchy consists of a number of components, we can create our own components. For instance, if I would take my move example script, I could add it here, and now it's a component for this. If I temporarily disable my, or remove my rigid body implementation, there are a number of ways to manipulate an object. If we go to our script that we created, it's always, initially, it always looks like this. There's a start method and an update method. As you can see here, with the explanation that you see, start is executed once when the object is enabled, or the scene is loaded, or when it's added to the scene. And there's an update method. The update method occurs every frame. There's all different variations of these update methods. There's, for instance, something called fixed update, which is called every frame as well, but it's typically the place where we need to go about doing physics manipulations. Now, there are two schools of thought when it comes to moving objects in Unity. One of this is access to the object. For instance, I can create a variable of the type transform and call it a sense of thing. And then when the object is loaded, and then this, I'm always having difficulty typing when I'm observing. And then when this object is initialized, I can retrieve from the object that is associated with the script. So let's jump back a little bit to Unity to show you what I mean. This object now has this example script, and through this example script, I can have access to all components that this object is made out of. One of these objects is a transform. So what I can do is, I can just say, get component, and then refer to the type of component that I'm trying to access, which in my case is a transform. Now, after this scene, after this object is initialized, in object transform, there will be a transform component. This transform component has a bunch of properties. For instance, it has a position property, and that position is what we call a vector field. It's just a collection of struct, if you know any programming, the struct that contains three floats, a float that expresses an x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. We can directly manipulate one of these axes and add sign values to it. But this is a really simple approach of doing it, right? You can say, well, this is your position. We're going to take this position. We're going to add 1 unit. We're going to add 1 unit to it. Now, I specifically take this notation. Those of you who are not exactly familiar with C# might not exactly see why I do, so let me just write it out more fully. Now you can say, well, I'm going to add 1 to this. Let's see what the error is.
Do you need the type of, I don't know, C#?
Probably this one. I'll probably have to manipulate the value straight away. Just can't really assign it.
Is it position a method? We should have some brackets.
You might. Even now,
We've done this a million times already. With the x, y, and z, you cannot directly give them a value.
Of course.
Yeah, you have to add a vector to the position, not an actual component.
We would indeed add a vector to it. So we would create a new vector,
Yes,
exactly.
exactly. Yeah.
Add values to that vector. So what I'm doing right now is, I would say, yes, to the existing position on the x-axis, I would add 1 unit. And this would translate to, just say this for a second. I'll tap back to my environment. The environment checks the code I've written, checks if there are any errors in there as well. If not, that code will run. And every update, so many times a second, it jumps away, of course. Many times a second on that axis that we've added our movements, will it change position? That's one way of it. There's a common way, and it's an extremely basic way. Now I've decreased the value by a factor of 1,000 and it's moved like this. Another way would be to, sorry?
Yes. So if you create a script and you alter the position of the script, will other phenomena be already you showed before you press play and the cube felt spread, so to speak.
It's a very good question. In fact, we have different versions of this update method. The most basic one, and the one you see when you start creating a script, is just update. And there's also something called late update or fixed update, and they each have their responsibilities. For instance, fixed update, if I'm not mistaken, is in charge of manipulations of physics. So what happens is update is executed before fixed update or before physics are applied. So if I hadn't removed the components that allow the physics engine to manipulate that object, my codes as well as physics would have manipulated it. Which brings me to what I was saying right now. This is one way of moving an object. Another way of moving an object is literally applying force to an object. I was opening my previous project here, a little bit more used to doing it that way. This is the presentation, the intro, which I started out with. And in my scripts here, just show you a little bit. In my scripts here, I have a forced area. And in that forced area, I access a list of objects, and to each object, I add particular force. So I access, this is one of the, I'll show you right away what I mean, make it more easier to see it in context. You just maximize here. So at this point in the presentation, when we see these cubes fall, at some point we get, it's called here. So we see we have our display on physics engine. At some point these are blown away again. So what happens, I just create in code, I check with a certain timer. When that timer has passed, I apply a physics to every object in a particular region. We talked about colliders just now. These colliders allow objects to interact with each other, but you can also use a collider as something we call a trigger. This is just a zone where if you enter that zone or exit that zone, you can book some code on it. So if you see those objects get blown away, the script that does that is just accessing all the lists of objects that it wants to apply this manipulation. It retrieves the rigid body component of it, and it applies force. And the force that is applied is again effectively a way to assign values to key axes. And since I've added this attribute, it is something that I can directly manipulate. If I go back to my scene, if I stop it, and if I go to the part where we can find all this.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
In the Visual Studio, we must link the code in the Unity workshop, the Unity XCA with the name of the project.
Normally not. What you can do is in the Unity configuration itself, we have a way to change what editor is used. You can go to Edit, Preferences, and that opens this screen. And then under External Tools, you should be able to select your development environment. Now, I'm usually using Visual Studio, so I have two options there. But there are other environments you can use as well, and depending on what you've installed. Once you have made a selection there, you can click the Regenerate Project Files button here, and that will change your project files to be able to be opened to the Unity. Have a try with that and let me know if it's working for you. Now, in any case, if you look at this platform, or at this part of the simulation, there is a object that I placed in the scene. On that object, I've assigned my forced area script that I was just displaying, and one of the things I can configure here is the factor of that force. And that is the way to expose it. Kind of hard to see if you're sitting all the way to the left side. This is just one way where we create scripts and have elements in that script be configurable in the editor. So we don't have any pure disconnect between the code we write and the manipulation of objects. We try to create scripts and everything that's relevant to be changed. We expose to the editor by this attribute.
Maybe this particular physics area appears associated with the type of objects.
Sorry?
I didn't follow from the beginning that the physics area or force area appears associated with the type of objects.
No, it's
Or lightness or
yeah, well, you must have a rigid body to be able to apply force to that body. Because marking an object as being manipulated by the physics engine, it must have a rigid body. Because we need to be able.
imagine in your initial example how to do that, how to define as a rigid body.
Yep, absolutely. Let me go back to my simple project. If we have my cube here, and you want it to be able to be manipulated by the physics engine, you simply click Add Components, enter rigid body. There's two ways why we do it like this. One, you must have a way to mark an object as configurable, but also you must have a way to enforce drag and mass of the object. Because the mass and the drag, if you have an object with a high drag, a low mass, it will fall really slowly, and vice versa. You must have ways to manipulate this one.
And about non-rigid objects?
Non-rigid objects. Can you manipulate them, or you mean soft bodies and then deforming objects? There's typically not a consideration in the Unity engine for that. What you would typically do if you want to represent it like that is you have an external tool that calculates that, and then you transfer it to Unity. So I saw you using, what was it, pipe form?
Yeah, bullets.
Oh, pipe bullets.
And you can combine bullets.
Yes, I think you can export it in a way that you're able to use it in Unity, and there's ways to manipulate the results there as well.
There's also in the physics section a little deep built-in called cloth simulation. So sort of flags or a net in a basketball game or something like that. For clothing, it's a bit rudimentary. If you want high detailed simulations like underneath, then I would go to David, the approach David proposed. First externally and then import it if you really want it. But in your case,
well, the answer for us is because these are really specialized tools, right? So if you would have a way to implement this in Unity, you would have a specialization for that, but there's probably already a tool that does that, such as that PyCode. So while I'm not saying this with 100% certainty, by the way, but while I assume that you're not the first person who want to have these soft body deformations used in a game engine. And there's many ways to approach it. If you want to have them real time and configurable, there's probably a workflow for it. But what you also see is that they're rendered as an animation in the modeling program. So that you can simulate your full soft body physics there and bake the animation as we call it. We create a bunch of keyframes, we have a timeline, and all the different vertex manipulations are placed as keyframes on the timeline and exported as that. But that doesn't really allow you to have a lot of manipulation once you've exported it. You have to recreate the simulation, bake it again, and then import it in the engine. So I'm guessing there's a better workflow, but it's beyond my experience. I'm hoping there is one. Any other questions?
For me, just a simple question. Because if Outlook says the code, imagine to associate that cube as indeed, I didn't know it was also.
We just create a script in our project folder, so remember this part of the screen represents what you have on your disk. You just do a right click, you create, you choose. Then you create a C# script. Now, it's important if you create a script that you enter the proper name right away. If you don't do that, You're going to have the worst name ever called my script. If I don't do it, or if I do it now, and I change the name of that script again, Unity has a tendency to lose the link of the script and the object, or the component it represents. Now, once you have a script like this, it's assignable as a component. So I can take my view again here. I can either drag my script to the object in a hierarchy, or I can click Add Component, and then I can enter the name of my script. So I call it my script very creatively. And as you can see, if I start adding a component and I enter the name, I can select my script there. And that's that way. Now, every time you do this, you have access to the script's start and update methods. So what we did just now, in the start methods, we took the transform, so the component that determines position and rotation and scale. We put it in a variable, so we only have to do this once. And then every frame, we applied this operation to it.
It reminds the Arduino code with a white setup and whiteboard.
Yeah, we should have a loop method instead of a. Yeah. Well, it's actually a little bit comparable. If you, of course, it's not possible physical object, but yeah, you have a setup method where you try to get everything ready, and then you have a repetitive. But one of the considerations when you're working with Arduino is you try to limit the things you do in your loop, right? Because every time you increase the time it takes to perform your loop, you make your code work slower. And that's the same approach you do in everything. Placing too much code in your update methods is a perfect way to lower your frame rate. So it comes with a little bit of experience or considerations you'll learn along the road. There's one tip I can give with that, to close my workshop here. If you're thinking about optimization, if you're thinking about having code that runs really well and really fast, it's a consideration to have at the start. It's a continuous consideration. Every time we write code, you need to have optimization and the speed at which it operates in mind. If you're going to not have any considerations for it, and then at the end of your project you find that your frame rate is too low, and you need to change it, and you need to make optimizations to your code, you'll have a huge workload. And there will never be a few operations or a few actions that you can do to alleviate the problem. You will have to go over every single aspect and make changes. If, however, there's a philosophy you keep in mind, for instance, when I get a transform component with the get component method, that I do it and I put it in a variable, instead of doing it every time when I frame is executed, that's a philosophy, that's a way of working that you learn and that you need to keep in mind. Alright? I think this is the available time we have. I'd like to thank you all for your attentive presence. I hope you've had some fun. I hope you at least know how to get started. As you know, something like this is a process of doing. We really ran out of time. As you know, this is hard to explain in a couple of hours. I can just show you some general workflows and I can get you started or at least create some interest in it. Anyways, you know where to find me, all of my cards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Years. Is it just this project?
Well, like,
To go back to the project as it's really it's not only I consider hiring first. That's what savings on see. Hopefully that's something that I said it's you're into the slide.
We would need a couple of hours for tutorials and stuff like that.
I'd love to hear those comments. You only brought them so it's still new here, right? Any best of luck with your information. Best of luck with your it's the same so it's not a week, that's thank you. See you later. Change CPU to GPU, so CPU right now it's using a processor. Now it will use a GPU, not necessarily a CPU. All the jelly figures, just generate that. Go back.
I'm just trying to make this the same example, and maybe, you know, my memory is.
I know it's probably
already visualize the problem. It's a phenomenon, so sometimes the many you can
we're still yeah, exactly. But still, the perspective is going to try your brain out.
yeah, it's like that.
That's very that's what this is.
I not getting shocked.
What if you can inside this window and press the shift? Yes. That's
Yeah, if you do that, then the thing will only exist in the
Once, yeah, you're
Yeah.
right.
Okay, so there,
it's changing.
yes.
Yeah, it's click the window, like when you're boss. Like there's pixels that start with
It's really
And for sure it's a menu.
Never.
But like in your RPF, it's not on the car, where it's short. So
Choose against and now can you go back to the let's go to edits. No, just you left edits. And then on the rendering, all the position. Materials, process graphics like so
yeah, it should be changed. It doesn't make sense to say, okay, because
let's decrease the size. So yeah, it's a good short of
you need to new vector tree, and yeah, you have to add the tree, go to edit one side, which is weird that you can't just do this. Or signal,
let's look it's settings problem, it's probably not readable, but it does the only thing it needs to update all the settings update, so everything is configured here. So next position, so let's go down to the post section. Let's change a little bit. So that goes to the clear transform and you take the position, go to other settings, the position, That's a
add another
executive level, it's fine, as well as that.
So it's something is missing. The position has the position, like the current position. So I need to find
I need to look for the size and if you transform the positions, that's all you reach. This one is like, imagine that this is, I can, yeah, I
No. You need to save it, I think.
So yeah, there's a
When does it here
okay, change linear, but also these two
cube, like the script, well,
let's first this off again, just this directly the way you run it. But where's the other matching it home because it should change. If the game here is okay, then it's
yeah, that's the thing that's a little bit weird because preview is okay, it's not good, and that's the game mode is okay. And when I render, it's okay. I can like okay. Oh, yes, and then you can change the camera.
and then the probably try looking for this as well.
Yeah.
Good luck finding a way to describe it, but
Yeah.
now I can't.
Since it's the first time using like it's a little bit hard to
Yeah.
Google the
But it's one of those things that you have all the time to use your time and something like this. I know. It's really frustrating. The only thing I can imagine, or the only thing I can remember, can you open that up? Yeah. The only thing I can.
this one is the one that
That's the one in the core.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I use
The same, but just more version.
It's more complex. Yes. Because
what is the
recommended one?
This one. Minus size in your.
It's just like, I think it's like if you enter this in Google, you try to find it means you have localized problem. Not something that would necessarily go wrong, because even a lot of people don't. It makes it extremely difficult to solve. I think the easiest step to try out now is to install different Unity for if you, for instance, if you click install editor, and then try to use the information, you always use one with LTS. So it's the same thing.
The terminal is support is something that
I have never decided until I was using it for recent work, and I skipped on using Unity.
yeah, like I used to be until like then I needed to start using the things for projects, something more complex, and then I reached the point that I had and then I started using all these things. Why do I have Windows that? And I sometimes I
was thinking, you might be using flex to your produce.
yes,
And I think it's going to be
I'm trying to build all the computer for myself like an access system in my computer with like some graphic cards that is good for this and some specialized VMs for Windows so that I can access VM almost all the time. I mean, with some proper graphic card and graphic configuration and so I'm just curious with this not working in this computer because I'm like making a workstation for this kind of stuff.
And this is why I do it use my laptop. It's pretty good for laptop, but it's long use it now. Every time like I filled part of my project, so when I'm doing a light viewer, I'm setting my lights quality, my quality is really, really high. I fixed everything lighter like this, it was not fine for other gentlemen, it's a nice way to direction. I hope you can figure it out, I'm sorry, I can always. As it turns into that's like the worst thing you can say, sorry. I think you should really go.
Yeah, but sometimes things like this happen. When something that's not but still, I think
Well, I'm still hoping to figure it out.
The numbers of the rotation. So that's what I mean by that. Those images, I use math into science stuff. But as soon as study is done, I have a specific project, and then it just, and 3 hours or something to come up with that work. If you know what you're doing, you how many guys will be here? More? You need to work on. But you have these cards.
Yeah.
In the contact.
I suppose that's the thing.
Yeah.
I already did, but
Because that's easier question. You saw our work on holograms. Yeah. I'm wondering if we can simulate with the lights. We have some drawing, that we put the light here and there, we make some movements and save as. So you're making that? Yeah. Ivan told me about the Marine's work with a camera inside the skin. But in our case, we need also to record somehow as we do with a cell phone. Because in the for our data sets of the holograms, hologram, that's we have different lights depending on the reflected to our eyes. We made usually 5-second videos. In each position, we record the image, of course. And maybe eventually we can simulate this process to have, because for our network, we really need copies, false holograms, mimicking the real ones.
And you also need to simulate how the camera is held and how it moves when you
We need to use exactly. So that's the sun drawing with different illuminations, colors, reflecting back to the camera.
There are reflective surfaces that give this rainbow sheen depending on how the light falls on it. And there are ways to create camera noise so that you simulate, because one of the challenges is not just having the right reflections, it's just your camera is constantly moving. And it's a benefit, it's a curse and it's a blessing. It can help you determine a little bit simply by moving. You have different geometric shapes and how the light will differently if you move your camera. That you can simulate. And if you approach, or if you make a simulation of that, instead of having the same size that you would in real life, to simulate a unit environment, I would scale it up enormously.
Enormously.
Yeah.
Why is that so?
So that all the little details are easier to manipulate and are easier to model. You can have it in small, but I think it's easier to see what. If it's really necessary. What we were talking about is the most recent version of Unity has made enormous improvements in how the way hands and faces were. So I remember one of the projects we were working on was spoofing the facial recognition cameras. And I think that would be
mine is Martin before. That's a great face.
I think it would be really helpful to, like for instance, instead of now having to hold a mask in front of the camera, I think you can virtualize it. I think you can have a parallel process where you have all different configurations of faces. Some of them look extremely lifelike, but they all lack the movement.
The lightning is very correct.
And we could like this is one of the people's really suggested is to focus on the exact ground footage. You have an exact idea of where it is, how the lighting is, and then you can focus on all the, like for instance, detecting the small movements that we all have on our faces, and then which you like if you're trying to smooth the facial recognition. Because they're doing they have software now that allows you to determine if you're really having your face in front of the camera or if you're playing a video or if you're something else.
Can you those kind of data sets? So it's still like
But moving from time to faces is really hard. animating faces or skin, pretty face because the subsurface pattern of light that is always partly penetrating your skin and partly being reflected by the way your pores and your skin is stretched and vesiculated. It's different how it's happening. Yeah. But nowadays, it's one of the showcases of 2021. Their facial features is just.
I just thought of something. There is a Unity conference in Amsterdam next November. Yeah, and not only Unity developers but also industry is always there. A lot of booths and also talks. And I was there already a few times. It's really worthwhile. It's only 2 days. It's not that expensive. It's only €2 to the which I'm guessing we all are. So.
And then, like, half of the people you meet here are not game developers, but like industry experts, and that is so valuable.
Also, Microsoft is there.
Do you know the guys of Magic Leap? Is it the night Magic Leap?
Yeah, they were there and we were there in Copenhagen.
Magic Leap, the guys have their own software or they use Unix as well? The guys who made the
Headset, Magic Leap. Headset.
That's it.
Yeah. They use Unreal or Unity or maybe something else to make applications for that headset.
Yeah. There are some challenges and quests of Magic Leap you can apply to try to have an idea to implement something.
But it's still in the market.
Yes, it's really good.
I think it failed.
Where it's built. I think it was also folded into some other company. That might be.
The high-end headset that was advertised for years didn't deliver. That's actually yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure of that.
What they have
We were in Copenhagen and they couldn't test it because there was a line.
Is the simulation of the airport?
No,
So that's all.
Mexico.
Which is my favorite game fixing Mexico.
I like very much workshops because 2 hours we enter another new field.
Yes.
In a more personal level, imagine in Skype and
I'll be honest, I visited you guys on the first day and I walked around 2 days thinking, what the hell am I going to teach these guys? They're all experts in their fields and I'm a generalist, there's a view that goes on.
So there is
Another field,
sorry, with another tool, because in my case, I don't know about you, I didn't know about that. And right now I installed, I ran a simple example, and it's nice.
Yeah, it's
It's like really nice polygon simulation, I would say.
now the ideas will start cooking, I guess. Yeah. There's no final solution to a tool. There's no one tool that does everything. And then over the years, you just you get familiar with so many different tools, and you start to learn which is that. And in the end, you can always combine these things as well. Yeah. I think that's cool.
Let's get to them, or?
Yeah.
This is yours now.
That's, I'm waiting for my order to be ready.
I don't know yours.
Thank you for inviting me.
By the way, since we are all students, we are just researchers right now.
Okay. So we're all even the teachers are students.
Yes.
We learn every day.
It's
a PhD job description. Thank you very much. It was a great lecture. Thank you for
Thank you.
That's the level of research.
So guys, you go right now, but that's better or?
We didn't have any plans. Because there is experience. We could drop by. Maybe there's this courtesy, but I don't know if it's a meeting or a visit.
I don't know where this office is.
Actually, I don't.
You can go to Honolulu because every in England has, or can go together to this area to ask the guys where's the office.
You don't know where those offices?
Myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
But it's okay. I don't. I have to
exams and she's really busy, and then we can just have all
I need to visit Coimbra a little bit more because it's the weather.
We were here, we arrived on Sunday, so we already have a pleasure of seeing the scenes. We said if you see the chapel around
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Everything in other cities of Portugal as well, like Lisbon, because
You're going to spend an hour in this one.
on the flight tomorrow.
Yeah, like, that's not it.
But there is another city called Porto. You know what that's close. Porto is